Around 1990, 91, my aunt was brutally murdered along with one of her daughters. And all because the father of her youngest child at the time, second to the youngest child at the time, did not want to pay child support. Somehow they ran into each other somewhere where it was by chance, and my aunt was so devastated. She told him she was going to take him to court for child support because she didn't want to see him anymore.
Say that you live in poverty. What does that mean? Well, poverty is defined as the state of having few material possessions or little income. This definition is vague, so the government gives it a number: 12,760. Make 1 cent more, and you are no longer legally impoverished. Make 1 cent less, and congratulations, you're now a statistic. And these statistics are frightening. More than 1 in 5 people in Maryland live below 200% of the poverty line. And according to Healthcare for the Homeless, over 50% of poor Marylanders live in deep poverty, meaning their incomes are below 50% of the federal poverty level. And a U.S. Census survey reveals that in Prince George's County, the poverty rate is just below that of Baltimore County. So what does this look like? Typically, an outsider views poverty as homelessness, or begging on a street corner, or some tribulation of a foreign child far away from the safety of America's borders. But poverty can look like this, and this, and this. That is, of course, unless you refuse to look at it. Instead, look at COVID. Look at police brutality. Look at education budgets. Of course, this is not to say in the slightest that any of those issues are unimportant, but it is to say that political attention has become zero-sum. So while our federal politicians are focused on foreign policy and national infrastructure, in theory, our local politicians are fighting day and night for the rights of the less fortunate. They're giving them places to sleep, food to eat, and promises of a better tomorrow, aren't they? Not quite. Local governments, despite perhaps their best intentions, aren't bridging the gap between the rich and the poor, nor are they adequately bettering the lives of society's undesirables via beneficial legislation. When you grow up having everything you need, it's easy to picture poverty as such a surreal experience that you're numb to it. But poverty is not a myth, and it's not insignificant.
Oh, absolutely. I see it every day. We have a group of tenants at CASA that we've worked with and organized with for almost 2 years now who have been on rent strike at Bedford Victoria Station and Langley Park. It's a community of almost 600 plus apartment units, and there's about 100 people that have been on rent strike for almost 2 years. And the work that they're doing collectively has been really inspiring to watch. But the reasons they're doing the rent strike is because conditions are horrible. I could show you, they have videos of mice, 6 or 7 mice on one trap. You have, ceilings collapsing. You have individuals that have mold and utilities like their stoves or appliances not working.
Living in poverty brings with it misery, and as a result, people struggle to cope.
The adults I saw, whether they were shooting dope, smoking, crack wasn't an issue back then, it was cocaine. He was shooting dope, snorting and sniffing dope. Then those who can afford the cocaine. Those were coping mechanisms.
But most importantly, poverty is secular. Children watch, and then they become.
You had role models that used drugs, end up in prison, came home, went back. You just knew that was the way of life for you. That was how you saw things. I mean, that's how, from your little youthful young lens, they were your role models. It wasn't the police officer that walked the street or the teacher that was in the classroom.
Typical pushback against social welfare includes arguments about incentive to work.
Merit-based or having to have a job makes it very difficult. And the temporary assistance makes it difficult. I don't think people in poverty want to stay in poverty, and oftentimes that's the way that the government views people in poverty, is that they get enough benefits from the government that encourages them not to get a job. And the research doesn't support that, and I don't think that people want to live like that. And so having that as a basis for poverty programs really is not focused on the right things to try and help people get out of poverty.
And welfare makes for a perfect example of governmental interaction. It is important to note that the government is not a faceless organization. It has many faces in the form of our elected officials. These very officials are key to change. In truth, our politicians are uniquely situated to help those of us that are voiceless.
Number one deliverable is our services. We connect people to housing attorneys, to immigration attorneys, to ESOL educational opportunities, to job placement and apprenticeship trainings. We do a lot of services for our community, and so we're trying our best not only to advocate for policies that will impact them and their families, but we're also giving them the tools necessary for them to make the changes that they want to see. And that's something that we have as a model at CASA, is that we put our members in the driver's seat of everything that we do, and they're at the forefront of any of the change that we're trying to make.
There have been great successes and great failures when it comes to poverty legislation, as come with all things. However, it has become apparent that poverty legislation is not a priority to our lawmakers. When asked if the topic of poverty legislation ever arose under Steny Hoyer, Howard Stone, former legislative assistant, stated,
"No, I can't recall that."
Is poverty high in our priorities that we are being very aggressive about overcoming it and addressing it in the county? So I don't think that's the case. And it's not, and I want to be clear, I'm not saying it's not the case because people don't care. I just think the priority is not as high as it should be.
This is reflected in our budgets.
But the actual budget, if you look at the county budget, it's less than, I think, 5% is devoted to human and social services.
A heavy limitation to any solution moving forward would be budget concerns. However, it's entirely possible to make room for those who need it when our politicians fight for them.
Actually, a majority of our city staff are public works staff, the people who pick up the trash and take care of the trees and the plants and, those kinds of mundane activities. They're people who have spent their lives working to support us in our community. And when they retire, they're going to have nothing. They're going to rely on Social Security, which really is not enough to get by.
Right.
At first, I thought it was going to be impossible. It was just going to be too expensive. And then looking at what the impact would be on those staff, it just started to seem essential.
Unfortunately, many politicians don't support these much-needed safety nets.
I think that our government and those who make policies are very much influenced by money. And obviously, those who have money are able to influence politics, and poor people don't often have representation. And since they don't have money to have that representation, they often are left by the wayside. And they're ones who generally probably are not voting at high numbers because of their economic status. So politicians tend to not give them as much weight as richer influences.
The issue of poverty is often swept under the rug. An overwhelming stigma surrounds it. So much so that people are ashamed to admit when they're living in lower socioeconomic areas. No one speaks about living in poverty until they've escaped it, until they've grown past the ability to be shamed for being poor. The poor of our nation are being treated like second-class citizens. They're forced to endure situations that anyone of higher socioeconomic status would have nightmares about. Poor people are forced to sit silently and numb the pain with whatever supplies the longest high, because politicians can't afford to prioritize them. And politicians are the key. The only way to break the cycle is to invest in the communities, to give people money for food so that they can put aside some of their paycheck as savings, to offer affordable housing to keep people off of the streets, to invest in the schools to give students a fighting chance in academia. The only people with the power to enact these reforms are our politicians. Change happens when bills are drafted. Change happens when bills are slated with those who need the money the most in mind. Change happens when politicians fight tooth and nail for their constituents. However, Prince George's politicians have proven that their efforts are concentrated everywhere but on poverty. The few in-depth attempts for change, while well-guided, have only resulted in backlash against the communities they're meant to help. Other bills never pass due to fighting between political ideologies in the legislature. And some bills are simply never written. Poverty is never brought to the table because no one wants to look at it. Our budgets leave no allotment to those in need, nor do our legislators discuss it frequently. Despite the empirical ability to make room in budgets, some politicians write off the excuse that there's no money and continue to sweep the poor under the rug. Simply put, no matter how well-meaning our politicians are, their legislation has yet to adequately address the issue of poverty. Oftentimes, that legislation doesn't even exist. Our politicians must do better to help those living in poverty, because they don't have a voice otherwise. Our local elected policymakers are meant to seek the best interest of their constituents, but if impoverished people are excluded, then they haven't done their jobs. Fortunately, there is no cause for despair, because no issue is without resolution.
I think we've got to have individuals that are in the legislature that come in understanding what those needs are and are focused and dedicated to eradicating a lot of the ills that impact people, particularly those impacted by poverty. Poverty we have to start seeing as a violence to community and start understanding what those ramifications of that violence are, which are health disparities, which are undereducation, underemployment, which are issues with housing and lack of transportation. I mean, when we underinvest in communities, we see the results. And so we got to stop.
Tax credit, because it really goes as a refundable tax credit. So it's tax money that it's the money that for those families, it's their money and it goes directly to them. So that's money in their pocket that they can use to get necessities, pay the rent. I think it's one of the most effective poverty fighting tools that we have in our arsenal to fight poverty.
No matter how far left or right, politicians have agreed that people must be helped as well as help themselves. And while the government cannot mandate self-discovery or betterment, it can serve its constitutional purpose and give people a chance. So perhaps this time, we can say that it may not be the people in poverty who need this message of the American dream, but rather our politicians. Work harder, and you can succeed.